What if everything you thought you knew about the origin of humanity was incomplete? What if the story that's been passed down through religious texts, debated in lecture halls, and quietly accepted by billions, was only a fraction of the truth? Imagine for a moment that the timeline we've embraced, the one that begins with a single man shaped from dust in a sacred garden, was never meant to be the full picture. What if, beneath the surface of tradition and translation there, lies a deeper, stranger, and far more profound account of where we come from? This isn't about conspiracy or speculation. It's about uncovering forgotten layers, buried not just in the soil of ancient civilizations, but hidden within the language, the structure, and the subtle silences of the world's oldest texts. It's about questioning assumptions so familiar, we don't even notice them anymore. Because if even one piece of that foundational story is misunderstood, the entire framework of how we view ourselves, our identity, our purpose, our place in the universe begins to shift. So ask yourself, are you willing to let go of certainty just for a moment? To explore a possibility that human history isn't a straight line, but a web of sacred callings, lost knowledge, and spiritual roles long forgotten? Because what we're about to examine may not just change how you see ancient history, may change how you see yourself. When most people think of the creation story in the Bible, they imagine a single, unified account, a seamless narrative where God creates the world in 6 days, forms Adam from the dust, places him in a garden, and fashions Eve from his rib. But a closer reading of Genesis reveals something far more complex and perhaps more intentional. There aren't just one, but two distinct creation accounts laid side by side. Genesis 1 presents a grand cosmic sequence of events: light, sky, land, stars, animals, and finally, humankind created male and female in God's image. It's sweeping, universal, and poetic, like a bird's eye view of the unfolding of all. Reality. Then, suddenly, in Genesis 2, the focus narrows dramatically. We're no longer observing the formation of the cosmos. We're on the ground, watching the careful shaping of a single man, placed in a specific garden, given a specific task. There is no mention of male and female being created together. Instead, the man is formed first, the animals are brought to him, and the woman is created later after, a divine recognition that it is not good for man to be alone. The sequence is different. The language is different. The tone is intimate rather than majestic. One chapter speaks of humanity. The next speaks of a human. For centuries, scholars have wrestled with how to reconcile these two accounts. Some claim they are simply poetic retellings of the same moment from different angles. But what if they aren't describing the same event at all? What if Genesis 1 is the account of the creation of humanity as a whole, a collective species? Infused with divine image in Genesis 2 is the story of a single appointment, a specific individual set apart for a sacred role, not a contradiction, but a layered narrative. One tells of creation's grandeur, the other of a personal calling within it. And that distinction may be the key to understanding everything that follows. When we open the Bible and begin reading the book of Genesis, it seems at first that we're entering into a single, unified account of creation. Light separates from darkness, the seas are gathered, stars are set in the heavens, and finally, on the 6th day, humanity is brought into existence, male and female, created in the image of God. It is a majestic narrative, cosmic in scope, and poetic in rhythm, like a divine symphony moving from chaos to order in precise and deliberate harmony. This is Genesis chapter 1, and for many, this is the creation story. But if we continue reading, something unexpected happens. Genesis chapter 2 begins, and it does not continue the story. It starts over. This second account doesn't pick up where the first left off. Instead, it presents a creation narrative that feels far more grounded, more intimate, more human. It zooms in, Now we are not watching from above. As the universe takes shape, we are down in the dirt, watching as God forms a single man from the dust of the earth and breathes life into his nostrils. The Garden of Eden is planted, not across the whole earth, but in a specific place in the east. Animals are formed, not before humanity, but after the man brought before him for naming. And when no suitable companion is found among the animals, God causes the man to sleep and forms a woman from his side. This isn't merely a continuation. It's a different rhythm, a different order, a different story. The contrast between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is striking. In the first chapter, humanity is created last, after the heavens, the earth, the plants, and the animals. They are created male and female together, not as individuals, but as a collective, the culmination of a cosmic plan. The language is elevated and distant. Let us make man in our image, God says. Male and female, he created them. It is a proclamation about all of humanity, without names, without location, without personal interaction. It is a theological declaration. Humans are image bearers of the divine, given dominion over the earth. But in Genesis 2, the entire structure is reversed. A man is created before the plants have grown, before the animals exist. He is placed in a garden, not just anywhere, but in a defined geographical region with rivers and borders. The woman does not appear at the same time as the man, but is formed only later and from his own body. Names begin to emerge. Specificity replaces generality. The tone shifts from cosmic to personal. It is here we meet Adam, not just as a concept, but as a person. For centuries, theologians and scholars have debated how to reconcile these two accounts. Some argue that Genesis 2 is merely a zoomed-in version of the sixth day in Genesis 1. That the author of Genesis first gives the overview, then returns to elaborate on a key moment. And perhaps that is the case. But what if it's not? What if Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are not describing the same event from two angles, but two different events altogether? What if the humans created in chapter 1 represent the general creation of the human species, male and female, scattered across the earth, and the human formed in chapter 2 is a separate act, a particular appointment, a chosen representative? This perspective opens the door to a deeper theological understanding. In Genesis 1, humanity is created in God's image and given a general mandate. Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. It is a universal blessing, a declaration of identity and purpose for all people. But in Genesis 2, something else is happening. The man is not simply created, he is assigned. He is placed in a sacred space. He is given the task of working and keeping the garden words in Hebrew that are later used to describe priestly duties in the temple. He is more than a human. He is a mediator, a priest, a steward of sacred ground. This shift from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 may not be a contradiction, but a progression. The first chapter tells us who we are as a species beings, created in the image of God. The second tells us about vocation and calling, the selection of one to represent the many. In this light, Adam becomes not the origin of humanity, but the origin of covenant. Not the first Homo sapiens, but the first man appointed to walk with God in sacred relationship, to serve in the temple of creation. This distinction matters. It allows the biblical narrative to harmonize with what science tells us about humanity's development, without losing its theological depth. It reframes the creation story not as a literal step-by-step biology lesson, but as a layered revelation first, of identity, then of calling. Genesis 1 declares the divine image in all of humanity. Genesis 2 introduces the story of a priest, a garden, and a divine commission. Together, they are not opposing views, but complementary parts of a deeper truth. One reveals who we are, the other, why we were chosen. When we read that God formed Adam from the dust of the ground and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it, we often imagine a simple agrarian task: gardening, farming, maintaining a beautiful paradise. But the Hebrew language reveals something far more profound, something that reframes Adam's entire role in Eden and forces us to reconsider what kind of story Genesis is really telling. The words used in Genesis 2:15, avad, to work, and shamar, to keep, are not ordinary terms for manual labor. They are deeply theological, liturgical words, rich with meaning, and used consistently throughout the Hebrew scriptures to describe priestly duties in the tabernacle and temple. Aved in Hebrew can certainly mean to work or to serve, and on the surface, it might suggest that Adam was simply assigned a task of cultivation. But when we trace this word throughout the rest of the Old Testament, we discover a surprising pattern. In passages describing the role of the Levites, the priests who ministered before the presence of God, avad is used to describe their sacred service. For example, in Numbers 3:7-8, the Levites are to perform the duties, avad, for him and for the whole community at the tent of meeting by doing the work, avada, of the tabernacle. This isn't about farming. This is about worship. This is about sacred responsibility. Similarly, the word shamar means to guard, to watch over, to protect. It is the same word used in Numbers 18:5 when God commands the priests to guard the sanctuary and the altar so that there will be no wrath on the Israelites. The priests weren't just caretakers. They were spiritual guardians, mediators between heaven and earth, charged with protecting the holiness of sacred space. So when Genesis says that Adam was placed in the garden to avad and shamar, it is saying far more than he was the first gardener. It is saying he was the first priest. This reorientation changes everything. Eden was not merely a beautiful place to live. It was a cosmic temple, a sacred space where heaven and earth overlapped. The very language used to describe the garden evokes temple imagery. The tree of life at the center recalls the menorah, the lampstand in the tabernacle, symbolic of divine presence. The rivers, flowing out of Eden, echo the streams that later symbolically flow from the Temple Mount in prophetic visions. And God's presence walking in the garden in the cool of the day mirrors the glory of God dwelling in the Holy of Holies. Eden is the original temple, and Adam is its original priest. This helps explain why Adam was formed in the way he was, not just from dust, but from dust breathed into by the Spirit of God. It's the image of divine inspiration, of a man set apart, consecrated for sacred duty. The purpose of Adam's creation was not merely to inhabit the world, but to stand as a covenant representative, one who would mediate the relationship between the Creator and the creation. His vocation was not survival or reproduction. It was intercession, stewardship. Worship. Understanding Adam's role as priest also sheds light on the gravity of the fall. Adam didn't just break a rule, he violated a covenant. He desecrated the temple. He failed not just as a human being, but as a representative. And in doing so, the sacred space was lost. The way into the presence of God was blocked. The cosmic temple was closed. And this too is reflected in the language. After the fall, cherubim are stationed to shamar, to guard the way to the tree of life. The same word that described Adam's original purpose now describes the angelic function. That replaced him. The priest has failed, and so divine guardians are installed in his place. But even in this tragedy, there is a prophetic whisper of restoration. Because if Adam's calling was priestly, then the story of redemption becomes not just about forgiveness, but about the reestablishment of the priesthood, about restoring the relationship between God and humanity through a new representative, a better Adam. This is why Jesus is later called the last Adam, not merely because he undoes the effects of the fall, but because he fulfills the role. Adam failed to complete. He becomes the perfect priest, not in a garden, but in a garden-turned-grave. Not guarding a tree of life, but hanging on one. He guards and keeps not Eden, but the hearts of those who follow him, making a way back into the presence of God. This vision of Adam as the first covenant partner, the first priest in the cosmic sanctuary, also reconciles the apparent contradiction between Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 describes humanity in general, male and female, created in the image of God. It is the creation of mankind as a species. But Genesis 2 zeroes in on something different, the appointment of one individual to a specific spiritual task. Not the first man biologically, but the first man spiritually called into covenant, given sacred duties, and placed within a sanctuary for worship and intercession. In this light, the story of Adam is not a biological origin myth. It is the opening act of a priestly drama that will span the entire biblical narrative, from Eden to Sinai, from tabernacle to temple, from Jesus to the church. It is a story of sacred vocation, divine purpose, and the long journey back to the eyes. Presence of the one who first walked among us in the garden, calling us to guard what is holy and serve what is eternal. Adam's purpose was never just to live in paradise. It was to mediate paradise to the world. And that calling, once lost, is now being restored in every person willing to step into that priesthood again. Cain's story, when read slowly and without assumptions, there's something unusual. It opens a door to a world we're not supposed to see. The traditional narrative of Genesis paints a picture of a simple beginning. One man, one woman, two sons. A tight, contained unit. But as we read on, we're confronted with a series of narrative details that don't quite fit. Details that suggest the world outside Eden wasn't as empty as we might assume. And nowhere is this more apparent than in Cain's fear, his fear of being found, being attacked, being killed by others. But who, exactly, was he afraid of? At this point in the biblical account, only 4 people have been mentioned: Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. Abel is now dead. That leaves 3. Yet Cain pleads with God that his punishment is too great to bear, that whoever finds me will kill me. The phrase is casual, instinctive, and without qualification. Cain doesn't ask if someone ever exists to find me, or if my future siblings come after me. He speaks as if it's already a populated world, one with danger, one with people. This is the first crack in the traditional reading, and it's not a small one, because if Cain believed there were others, the natural question must follow: where did they come from? What happens next only deepens the mystery. Cain is marked by God for protection, and then leaves to dwell in the land of Nod, east of Eden. There, he takes a wife. She conceives and bears a son named Enoch, and then, almost as if this is a normal, expected progression, Cain builds a city, not a tent, not a house. A city, the kind of structure that requires planning, labor, inhabitants, purpose. Who is this city for? His son? His parents? Himself? One child and a wandering man do not a city make. The presence of a city suggests a population, a society, an infrastructure, and yet none of these people have been mentioned before. They appear like shadows present implied, but never explained. Traditionally, this is resolved by assuming that Adam and Eve had many other children who populated the earth. Genesis 5-4, for instance, tells us Adam had other sons and daughters. The argument goes that Cain married a sister, and that the world began to populate rapidly. But this explanation, while functional, creates new problems. First, there's the issue of incest. Are we to assume that the original community of God's image bearers developed entirely through brother-sister pairings? If so, wouldn't the text provide clarification for something so morally and biologically fraught? Second, The timeline strains under scrutiny. How quickly would Adam and Eve need to bear children, raise them, and see them form families in order to populate a city large enough for Cain to fear vengeance or justify urban construction? But perhaps the deeper issue is that this traditional reading requires a number of unstated assumptions. That humanity began with a single couple, that all subsequent people came from them, that no one else existed before or beside them. Yet the text itself doesn't explicitly say any of this. Instead, it presents Adam as the first man in the garden. Yes, but not necessarily the first human being ever to walk the earth. What if Adam wasn't created because there were no people, but because there was no one yet assigned to a specific spiritual role? Genesis 2-5 offers a subtle but powerful hint. There was no man to work the ground. Not, there was no man at all. The phrasing is functional, not existential. It implies a purpose waiting to be fulfilled, not a species waiting to be born. In Hebrew, the word used for man in that verse is Adam, the same word that later becomes the name Adam. But Adam doesn't always refer to a single person. It can mean mankind, humanity. It's a flexible word, layered with meaning. In Genesis 1, God creates Adam in his image. Male and female, he created them. This is not an individual. It is a collective. It is humanity as a whole. In Genesis 2, Adam the man is formed from the dust, placed in the garden, and given a specific job: to serve Avad and keep Shamar, sacred space. One is universal, the other particular. One is biological, the other vocational. Seen this way, Adam's role shifts. He is not merely the first human. He is the first covenant partner, the first priest of a cosmic temple, the one chosen from among humanity to mediate between heaven and earth. Eden becomes not the birthplace of mankind, but the sanctuary of God, a sacred zone set apart from the rest of the world. And when Adam fails, when the covenant is broken and the gate is closed, humanity is not erased, it is cast out. It returns to a world that was already there. And so when Cain is exiled east of Eden, he is not wandering into a void. He is entering the world beyond the sacred boundary, a world populated by people who were never inside the garden to begin with. People who, like the humans created in Genesis 1, carry the image of God, but were not called into covenant. People who have lives, relationships, culture, and memory, none of which are detailed in the biblical account, because they are not the focus of the story. The focus is Eden. The focus is the priesthood. The focus is the failure of the one chosen to stand between God and the rest of the world. Cain then becomes a kind of echo of that failure. He too is cast out from the presence of God. He too walks eastward into a world that does not know Eden. And what he finds, there is not an empty wilderness, but a populated land. He finds a wife. He builds a city. He begins a lineage that includes art, metallurgy, agriculture, and music. These are not the inventions of a primitive wanderer. They are the signs of a civilization already in motion, a world already unfolding, alongside and perhaps in parallel with the story of sacred space. What emerges from this reading is not a contradiction, but a dual narrative. The story of Genesis is not simply the origin of humanity in the biological sense, but the origin of humanity's relationship with the divine. Adam's line is not the only line. It is the covenant line. It is the priestly lineage, the spiritual thread through which God will later call Abraham, raise prophets, establish Israel, and ultimately bring Christ, the last Adam, the final mediator, the one who will restore access to the presence lost in Eden. The people in Nod are not plot holes. They are the background that becomes visible only when we read Genesis not as a literal genealogy, but as a theological drama. Cain's fear, his wife, his city, These aren't anomalies. They are clues. They are evidence that the garden was never the whole world, and Adam was never meant to be seen as the father of all human beings in a purely biological sense. He was a representative, a spiritual archetype, and his story, like Cain's, is not about genetics. It's about access. It's about sacred responsibility, Dot. So the next time we read Genesis, perhaps we should slow down when Cain says, "Whoever finds me will kill me." Perhaps we should hear it not as a narrative error, but as an invitation to look deeper, to question more honestly, and to consider that the story of humanity is far larger, far older, and far more profound than we've been taught. Maybe Eden was never meant to explain where we came from, but to remind us where we were always meant to be. When we think of the Garden of Eden, we tend to imagine it as the birthplace of all humanity, as if the story of Adam and Eve represents the literal beginning of every human being who ever lived. But what if Eden wasn't the whole world? What if it wasn't even meant to be? The language of Genesis never says that Eden encompassed the entirety of creation. In fact, it implies the opposite. A garden is described as being planted, as if inserted into a larger landscape. It has borders, a specific location, and rivers that flow out from it into other lands. The text names 4 rivers, including the Tigris and Euphrates, and refers to regions like Havilah and Cush, geographical references that imply a broader map. Eden, in this context, isn't the world itself. It's a place within the world, a sacred zone, a divine sanctuary. And that raises a question far more provocative than it might initially seem. If Eden was just one place, who or what existed outside it? If we let the narrative speak on its own terms, a new picture begins to emerge. Adam is formed and placed in Eden to work it and keep it. He is not formed in Eden, but placed into it, suggesting that the garden is not his point of origin. It is his assignment, a sacred post. This subtle but deliberate phrasing opens the door to a new way of reading the story, not as the beginning of all humanity, but as the beginning of a covenantal relationship between God and one specific human. Adam becomes the archetypal priest, Eden the first temple. And outside this holy boundary, a world already moving, populated, alive. When Cain is exiled from Eden's vicinity and goes east to the land of Nod, he doesn't disappear into desolation. He finds a wife, starts a family, and builds a city. These actions don't make sense. If Cain is the second generation of the only humans on Earth, but they make perfect sense if humanity already existed outside the garden. That's not a loophole, it's a literary breadcrumb. The text is inviting us to reconsider what Eden was for. Not a cradle for the human species, but a concentrated point of contact between heaven and earth. A realm where divine presence dwelled, in a unique and unfiltered way. And when we bring in what we now know from human anthropology, the parallels become striking. Archaeological evidence places early Homo sapiens in various regions of Africa and the Near East, long before the supposed timeline of biblical Eden. These humans had language, tools, art, and social structure. They buried their dead. They honored the sky. In other words, they lived full and complex lives. Genesis doesn't deny this. It simply doesn't address it because its focus is theological, not ethnographic. It's not trying to explain the emergence of Homo sapiens in a biological sense. It's telling the story of sacred vocation, of divine human partnership, of a specific man placed in a specific place, given a task far greater than survival, to represent the rest of humanity. In communion with God, Eden was a place of convergence, not origin. A cosmic sanctuary where the Creator walked with the created. It is patterned like a temple, central trees like altars, rivers flowing like lifeblood, boundaries like outer courts. And just as Israel would later have its tabernacle in the wilderness, surrounded by a broader camp of people, Eden functions as the first sacred center amidst a larger human world. This helps explain why Eden's loss had such global consequences, not because all humans lived there, but because the one who represented them failed. The priest fell, the gate was closed, and sacred space was no longer accessible in the same way. This view also reframes the meaning of human history. The biblical story isn't primarily about where we came from, but about how we were meant to live. It speaks not of isolated origin, but of interrupted relationship. The story of Adam and Eden is not an origin myth in the modern scientific sense. It is a sacred drama, a commissioning, a loss, and ultimately a promise of restoration. That restoration continues through the biblical arc. Just as Eden was a garden, with divine presence, the tabernacle became a mobile Eden. The temple in Jerusalem replicated Eden's layout. And in the New Testament, Jesus is portrayed as walking among gardens, turning water into wine, calming chaotic waters, restoring life-all imagery that harkens back to Eden. He is called the last Adam, not because he was biologically first, but because he succeeds where the first failed. He reopens access to sacred space, not by rebuilding the garden, but by becoming the meeting point between heaven and earth. Understanding Eden as a sacred zone, rather than the whole world, liberates the Genesis account from unnecessary tension. With science and history, it allows us to read the Bible not as a biology textbook, but as a theological epic. It accounts for the presence of other people, other lands, and even other civilizations hinted at throughout Genesis. When Cain builds a city, it's no longer a mystery, it's a continuation. When his descendants forge tools and compose music, it's not sudden advancement, but evidence of a broader human story, unfolding alongside the biblical one. So maybe the question is not, where did the other people come from? Maybe the better question is, why was Adam chosen? And the answer may lie not in what Adam was, but in where he was placed. Eden wasn't about population, it was about presence. It was about responsibility. It was about what it meant to be truly human in the divine image, not simply to exist, but to live in relationship with the Creator God. And if that's true, then perhaps the world outside, Eden, rich, populated, diverse, was never outside God's awareness. Perhaps it was always part of the plan. A world waiting for someone to lead it in worship. A world longing for a priest. A world that still, in many ways, longs for Eden not as a place we left behind, but as a presence we are being invited to return to. For generations, Adam has been viewed primarily as the biological beginning of the human race, the first man, formed from the dust, the starting point of humanity's lineage. But what if that's only part of the story? What if Adam wasn't just the first human chronologically, but the first in a much more profound sense, a spiritual archetype rather than merely a genetic progenitor? The Bible's treatment of Adam doesn't focus on bloodline so much as it focuses on role, calling, and covenant. And when we begin to read Adam this way, not simply as the first man, but as the first representative, we begin to see how his story echoes all the way into the New Testament. We begin to understand why Jesus is called the last Adam. This reframing begins in Genesis itself. The narrative doesn't just say Adam existed. It places him in Eden with a task that transcends survival or reproduction. He is not merely told to live, he is commissioned to guard, to serve, to represent. The Hebrew terms used, avad and shamar, are not everyday farming words. They are priestly terms used later to describe the ministry of the Levites in the tabernacle. Adam is, in effect, the first priest. His role is to maintain the holiness of sacred space, to mediate the relationship between God and creation. He is placed in the garden, not as a citizen, but as a steward, not as a biological prototype, but as a covenantal partner. This is where the typology begins to form. Because when Adam fails, when he breaks covenant, desecrates sacred space, and is exiled from God's presence, he doesn't just bring consequences upon himself. His failure ripples outward. The ground is cursed, death enters the story, and access to Eden is blocked. Adam's failure, then, is not simply a moral lapse. It's the collapse of a spiritual office. A priest has fallen. The temple is closed. And humanity, still bearing the divine image, now walks at a distance from its source. Fast forward to the New Testament, and this pattern doesn't just reappear, it is fulfilled in stunning detail. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul draws the connection explicitly. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. The contrast is profound. Adam is associated with dust, mortality, and separation. Jesus, the last Adam, is associated with spirit, resurrection, and restoration. The language here isn't coincidental. Paul isn't making a poetic aside. He's revealing the deep theological symmetry between Genesis and the Gospel. Adam brings exile. Jesus brings return. The symmetry goes further. Adam is tempted in a garden and fails. Jesus is tempted in a garden and remains faithful. Adam eats from a tree and is cursed. Jesus hangs on a tree and becomes the curse for us. Adam is clothed with skins to cover shame. Jesus is stripped so that shame might be overcome. Adam is driven east of Eden, away from the presence of God. Jesus, after resurrection, ascends to the right hand of the Father, reopening the way to divine presence. These are not random parallels. They are the completion of a narrative arc that began in sacred soil and ends in a sacred tomb left empty. Seeing Adam as a spiritual first allows us to embrace both the ancient story and its ultimate fulfillment without needing to force them into modern categories. We no longer need to pit Genesis against science or insist on a genetic bottleneck from a single couple. Instead, we recognize Adam as the first covenantal human, chosen from among humanity to bear spiritual responsibility, and Jesus as the final representative who succeeds where Adam failed and restores what Adam lost. In this light, salvation is not just forgiveness, it is reinstatement. It is the return to priesthood, to Eden, to the presence of God. And the implications are staggering. If Adam is the first priest and Jesus the last, then every follower of Christ is invited into that same calling. As Peter writes, "You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation." This isn't metaphor, it's restoration. The story that began in Genesis isn't just ancient, it's ongoing. The calling that Adam received in the garden hasn't been abandoned. It's been renewed, expanded, fulfilled in Christ, and now passed on to his people. So perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. The real issue isn't whether Adam was the first human biologically. It's whether we understand the depth of his role spiritually. Because once we see Adam not as a starting point, but as a pattern, everything else begins to make sense. The fall is no longer just a personal sin, it's a cosmic rupture. And the cross is no longer just a sacrifice, it's a coronation. The story isn't about returning to Eden's geography, but Eden's purpose. It's not about going back in time, but forward into restoration. In the end, Adam and Jesus form the two pillars of human destiny, the one through whom death entered and the one through whom life returns. And between them lies the whole sweep of history, the longing of every heart, and the divine invitation to once again walk with God in the cool of the day, not in shame, but in restored communion. The story of Scripture, then, is not about two men in isolation, but about two Adams who define the course of humanity, not by biology, but by covenant. Across the ancient world, scattered among the ruins of empires and carved into the stone of forgotten temples, are stories that echo each other with uncanny familiarity. Tales of a golden age lost, of gods who walked among men, of sacred gardens, divine trees, and catastrophic ruptures between heaven and earth. From Sumerian tablets to Greek epics, from Egyptian hymns to Hindu scriptures, humanity's oldest myths seem to remember something shared, something sacred, something lost. And when we compare these global traditions to the Eden narrative found in Genesis, the similarities are too striking to ignore. It is as if the memory of Eden didn't vanish with the exile of Adam and Eve, but scattered like fragments across the ancient world, resurfacing in different forms, languages, and symbols. Take, for example, the Sumerian myth of Dilmun. In this early Mesopotamian account, Dilmun is described as a pure, bright land, without disease, without death, a sacred place where animals live in harmony and life flows freely. The gods walk in this paradise, and one of them, Enki, is associated with a sacred tree and a female figure named Ninhursag, who births the first humans and plays a role in a moral fall that results in a curse. The parallels to Eden are unmistakable. A pristine garden, divine presence, a woman, a tree, and a fall. Even the structure of the story, harmony followed by transgression, followed by exile, follows the Genesis template. Move west to Greece. And the myth of the Golden Age emerges a time when humans lived close to the gods, when the earth yielded fruit without labor, when there was no suffering, no war, no toil. Hesiod writes of this age as a lost era of innocence, before the decline into the Silver, Bronze, and Iron Ages. The transition from divine fellowship to human struggle mirrors the Genesis account of Paradise Lost. And more tellingly, in the myth of Prometheus, we find a forbidden gift, fire stolen from the gods and given to humanity, triggering divine punishment and a widening gap between mortals and the divine. Again, the pattern emerges. Boundary crossing, knowledge acquisition, divine judgment, and exile. In Egyptian mythology, the story of Isis and Osiris contains yet another echo. Osiris, a divine king, is betrayed and killed, and his death leads to the disruption of divine order on earth. Isis, the archetypal mother goddess, seeks to restore balance and life. Themes of sacred kingship, death, restoration, and cosmic imbalance run deep, paralleling the loss and longed for redemption found in the Eden story. Even the Egyptian Book of the Dead speaks of a field of reeds, a paradise-like afterlife that resembles Eden's peace and fertility, paradise lost and hoped for again. The flood myths are perhaps the most universal. Nearly every ancient culture has a version of a catastrophic flood sent by the gods to reset or punish humanity. Noah. In the Bible, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Deucalion in Greek myth, Manu in the Hindu scriptures. In each, a chosen survivor is warned by a deity, builds a vessel, and begins civilization anew after the waters recede. These stories, scattered across time and geography, don't contradict the biblical narrative, they validate it. They suggest that humanity retains a collective memory of a great judgment, of divine intervention, of starting over. They are narrative fossils, remnants of a story once shared before cultures drifted and languages divided. What makes these parallels so compelling is not just their content, but their structure. Over and over, we find the same mythic architecture. An original state of harmony, a boundary or command, a transgression, and a resulting fall or exile. The story arc repeats itself across continents and centuries. And that repetition suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests memory, a shared memory, refracted through different lenses, preserved in ritual, song, and symbol. If Genesis tells us the true version of the story, the central thread, then these other myths may be echoes, distorted but not disconnected. Theologically, this idea has weight. Romans 1 says that the knowledge of God was once clear to all humanity, but was suppressed and exchanged for lesser truths. Genesis 11 describes the scattering of nations at Babel, dividing language and culture. From a biblical worldview, these myths are not threats to the truth. They are ripples from an original event, fragments of a forgotten wholeness. They testify to a collective past our ancestors once knew but no longer understood fully. Culturally, this invites a richer view of Scripture. The Bible doesn't exist in a vacuum. It was written in the ancient Near East, in a world saturated with myth, symbol, and spiritual longing. But rather than borrowing from myth, the Genesis account reorders it. It strips away the pantheons, the squabbling deities, the chaos-driven origins, and presents a different vision. A single creator, purposeful design, moral accountability, and relational depth between God and humanity. Genesis isn't just another myth, it's the myth made real. A sacred memory restored. This comparative approach doesn't water down the uniqueness of Eden, it highlights it. It shows that while cultures diverged in their interpretations, the core longing remained the same. A memory of intimacy with the divine, a fall from grace, a hope for return. Eden may have been lost geographically, but it was never erased spiritually. It echoes in every story we've told about ourselves, of paradise and exile, of gods and gardens, of justice and hope. In the end, these global myths don't undermine Genesis. They illuminate it. They help us see that the story of Eden isn't just the story of one tradition. It may be the foundational memory of humanity itself, a shared past hidden in plain sight, waiting to be remembered. And if that's true, then perhaps the longing that fills these ancient myths, the desire to return, to reconcile, to find home again, isn't just mythic, it's prophetic. A deep, collective yearning for Eden, not as metaphor, but as the truest story we ever knew. Across deserts, beneath forests, and hidden under layers of earth and time, ancient stones speak. They bear no voice, yet they whisper stories we can barely comprehend. And in recent decades, discoveries in archaeology have begun to challenge our assumptions about early human history. We have long believed that civilization as we know it agriculture, urban centers began around 3000 BCE with Sumer in Egypt. But certain sites do not fit this linear narrative. They seem out of place, out of time, too advanced, too precise, too intentional. They point to a forgotten chapter in the human story, one that may have deeper connections to the biblical narrative than we dare to admit. Take Göbekli Tepe, for instance. Located in southeastern Turkey, this site was unearthed in the 1990s and immediately defied everything scholars thought they knew about prehistory. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at around 9600 BCE, more than 11,000 years ago. That's before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before writing, before the wheel, before pottery. According to conventional timelines, humans at that point were simple hunter-gatherers, nomadic bands with crude tools and no concept of religion or architecture. And yet, here at Göbekli Tepe, we find massive stone pillars arranged in concentric circles, carved with animals, symbols, and humanoid forms. The stones weigh tons. Some stand over 16 feet tall. They were quarried, transported, and set with skill and coordination we didn't think humans possessed at that time. More startling is what Göbekli Tepe appears to be. Not a city, not a settlement, but a temple. There are no signs of domestic life, no hearths, no homes, no burials. It is sacred space, intentionally constructed. Which begs the question, why would people with no known hierarchy, agriculture, or permanent housing build something so monumental? And for what purpose? The implications are massive. Rather than religion evolving after civilization, Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse, that religious practice may have been the catalyst for civilization. Humanity was building altars before it was building homes. This turns the evolutionary view of religion on its head, and it lines up remarkably with the biblical narrative. Genesis doesn't begin with cities or nations. It begins with a garden, a sacred space, a divine encounter. Eden is not just a location, it is a sanctuary. Adam is not just a man, he is a priest. The first human act was not agriculture or trade, it was worship, communion, sacred duty. And when that relationship was broken, when Eden was lost, humanity was cast into the world. But the longing for sacred space remained. Could Göbekli Tepe be a post-Adamic attempt to recreate that lost sacredness? Could it represent an echo of a forgotten covenant, a memory buried in stone? We cannot say for certain, but the pattern is suggestive. When humanity lost access to divine presence, it began building. It began reaching back toward the heavens, with towers and temples, with ziggurats and pyramids. These were not just structures, they were yearnings made tangible. Memory solidified into monoliths. Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon offers a similar enigma. The site is home to the ruins of Roman temples, but beneath them lie the foundations of something far older and far more mysterious. Massive stone blocks form the base of the temple complex, including 3 stones known as the trilithon, each weighing an estimated 800 to 1,000 tons. Nearby lies the stone of the pregnant woman, a megalith estimated to weigh over 1,200 tons, the largest cut stone ever found. These stones were not only quarried, but moved and positioned with precision that defies modern replication. To this day, engineers debate how such feats were possible without advanced machinery. The Romans built impressive structures on top. Yes, but they did not move these base stones. The foundational platform was there before them. And who built it? No one knows. What kind of civilization had the capacity to move and place stones of such size and weight? And more importantly, why? Why such extreme effort for a platform that, in its original context, we barely understand? There are no written records, no clear signs of the builders. Only the stones themselves, silent and enduring. Some have suggested alien intervention or lost super technologies. But what if the explanation is simpler, yet deeper? What if these are the ruins of a humanity that once walked in sacred presence? What if these are echoes of Edenic memory, distorted and repurposed through time? The Bible gives us brief, tantalizing hints of a world more complex than we typically imagine. Genesis 4 speaks of Cain's descendants building cities, forging tools, composing music, and mastering agriculture. These are not primitive brutes. They are artisans, innovators, founders of culture. By Genesis 6, humanity is described as being widespread, powerful, and most intriguingly corrupted by forbidden knowledge. As sons of God, see the daughters of men, and take them as wives, resulting in the Nephilim mighty ones, giants, men of renown. The language here is strange, but deliberate. Something unnatural has occurred, something that breaks the divine order. Many have speculated about the Nephilim, and theories abound. Some see them as mythological, others as symbolic. But what if they're both? What if the legends of giants, demigods, and hybrid beings found in nearly every ancient culture are all echoes of this strange Genesis moment? From the Titans of Greece, to the Anunnaki of Sumer, to the Apkallu of Assyria, nearly every ancient civilization speaks of beings who descended from the gods, imparted knowledge, and were ultimately judged or cast down. Could the high technologies and inexplicable architecture we see in ancient sites be the lingering fingerprints of that era? The era before the flood, when human and divine boundaries were blurred? Again, the Bible does not elaborate in detail, but it doesn't need to. It plants seeds enigmatic, open-ended, but potent. Genesis 6 ends with a divine judgment, the flood, not just because of violence or corruption, but because of the breaking of boundaries. Humanity had gone too far. Knowledge had become perverse. Sacredness had been defiled. The flood wipes the slate clean, but remnants remain. The ark lands, the world restarts. But the memory of what once was, the cities, the monuments, the myths lives on. It is possible that sites like Göbekli Tepe and Baalbek are physical remnants of this antediluvian world. Not direct proof, perhaps, but evidence that something sophisticated existed long before our textbooks say it should have. A civilization or a network of civilizations, driven by spiritual purpose, building on a scale that speaks not of survival, but of meaning. Their orientation to the stars, their alignments with solstices, their geometry and symbolism, all suggest a worldview far more advanced than primitive humans with stone tools. These were not merely trying to live, they were trying to remember. And perhaps that is the deepest truth here. The stones themselves are memory. Human beings, from the beginning, have memorialized meaning in matter. We carve our beliefs into temples. We raise monuments to our gods. We write myths to preserve truths we no longer fully understand. The megalithic sites around the world are not random. They are sacred landscapes filled with intention. They testify to humanity's ancient desire to touch the divine. In this light, the biblical narrative is not isolated, it is central. It gives meaning to the mystery. It offers a frame for the fragments. It tells us that we were once in communion with God, that we lost it, and that we have been building altars ever since. Some of those altars still stand, weathered by time, buried by dust, misunderstood by modern minds. But they are there, speaking to anyone willing to listen. We don't need to claim that Göbekli Tepe was Eden, or that Baalbek was built by giants. To make the point, we only need to recognize that these sites challenge the simplistic version of human history that treats ancient people as ignorant brutes. The evidence before us suggests something else entirely a human past, filled with intelligence, purpose, and a longing for the sacred. And that lines up precisely with the early chapters of Genesis. Not as a literal map of Stone Age development, but as a spiritual record of human vocation and its loss. Ultimately, the archaeological record and the biblical account converge in mystery. They do not always offer clear answers, but they invite the same kinds of questions. Who were we, really, in the beginning? What did we know? What did we lose? And what have we been trying to rebuild ever since? Perhaps that's why these ancient sites resonate so deeply. Not because they give us proof of Eden, but because they remind us of our disconnection from it. They confront us with our forgotten greatness, our fractured memory, and our unyielding desire to reach toward the heavens. And that desire to build, to remember, to restore, may be the truest evidence of all that Eden was never just a myth. It was a reality we still long to return to. And maybe, just maybe, we're not uncovering the past simply to study it, but because deep down we remember it. Not with words or maps, but in dreams, in longing, and in stone. To understand Eden rightly, we must move beyond the simple image of a lush garden filled with trees and animals. Eden was not merely a paradise, it was a prototype. Not only the dwelling place of the first human, but the first expression of sacred architecture in Scripture. Everything about Eden's design, its vocabulary, and the commission given to Adam suggests something far more profound than a biological origin story. Eden was the first temple, and Adam its first priest. This is not poetic metaphor, it is embedded in the very language of Genesis, in the Hebrew verbs used to describe Adam's role, and in the structural and symbolic parallels drawn between Eden and later temples in Israel's story. In Genesis 2:15, we read, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. At first glance, this might seem like a mundane assignment to garden, to tend, to preserve. But the original Hebrew terms used here are aved and shamar, and these words, when examined closely, unlock the theological heart of Eden. Avad, often translated as to work, carries the meaning of service, yes, but not merely agricultural labor. It is the same word used throughout the Torah to describe the duties of the priests and Levites within the tabernacle and temple. In Exodus 3:12, God tells Moses, "When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship Aved God on this mountain." In Numbers 3:7-8 and 8:26, Avad refers specifically to the service of the Levites in maintaining the sanctuary. It is the work of worship, of sacred stewardship. Likewise, shamar does not merely mean to keep in the passive sense. It means to guard, to protect, to preserve. In Leviticus and Numbers, it is frequently used to describe the priestly responsibility of guarding the holy things, ensuring that what is sacred is not profaned. Numbers 18-5 is explicit. You shall keep, shamar, the charge of the sanctuary, and the charge of the altar, that there may be no wrath any more on the people of Israel. When Genesis 2 says Adam was to avad and shamar the garden, it is declaring his priestly function. He was to serve and guard the sanctuary. Eden, then, was not just his home, it was his tabernacle. And Adam was not just its inhabitant. He was its mediator. This reading is not speculative. It is rooted in the canonical patterns that stretch from Genesis to Revelation. Consider the layout of Eden itself. In Genesis 2:10, we are told that a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden. And from there, it divided and became 4 rivers. This flowing river imagery appears again in temple language, most notably in Ezekiel 47, where water flows from the temple threshold, giving life to the desert. It appears again in Revelation 22, where the river of life flows from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the New Jerusalem. Eden's river is not incidental. It is the first sign of sacred geography. Water flowing from divine presence to bless creation. The trees in Eden, too, speak to temple symbolism. At the center of the garden is the tree of life, just as at the center of the tabernacle was the menorah, fashioned as a tree with branches, blossoms, and lamps. The menorah, like the tree, is a source of light and a symbol of divine life. The imagery connects Eden not only to later Israelite worship, but to the idea that divine presence always resides at the center of sacred space. Even Eden's access points are temple-like. After the fall, when Adam and Eve are exiled, cherubim are stationed at the east of the garden to guard the way to the tree of life with flaming swords, Genesis 3:24. In the tabernacle and temple, cherubim are prominently displayed on the Ark of the Covenant, on the veil separating the Holy of Holies. They represent the boundary between the holy and the profane. Their role is the same in Eden as it is in the temple, to guard the divine presence from unauthorized access. Adam was meant to do this. He was meant to shamar the sacred space. When he failed, that task was reassigned to heavenly beings. The orientation of Eden also matches temple geography. Eden is in the east, and later, the entrance to both. The tabernacle and temple faced east. The worshiper moved westward to approach the Holy of Holies, just as Adam would have moved westward to the tree of life. These directional details are not trivial. They are part of a consistent biblical pattern, revealing Eden as a sacred model upon which later holy places were patterned. What this tells us is that the Genesis account is not describing a primitive or mythic time before religion. It is describing the inauguration of sacred responsibility. Adam is not a farmer who happens to live in a garden. He is a priest called to mediate between heaven and earth. His calling is spiritual before it is agricultural. Eden is not simply beautiful, it is holy. It is the first sanctuary, and Adam's failure is not just moral, it is covenantal. He doesn't just eat a forbidden fruit. He desecrates the sacred. He profanes the temple. He fails as a priest. Priestly interpretation of Adam also explains the continuity of the biblical narrative. After Eden, the pattern of sacred space and priesthood continues. Noah builds an altar and makes offerings. Abraham builds altars wherever he goes. Melchizedek, the mysterious priest king of Salem, blesses Abraham with bread and wine. Moses receives the tabernacle pattern directly from God, a mobile Eden complete with cherubim, trees, gold, and a central sanctuary. The Levitical priesthood is established to serve and guard this space, using the same language once used of Adam. Then the temple comes under David and Solomon, again oriented eastward, again guarded by cherubim, again filled with tree-like decoration, gold, and sacred water. It's not a new pattern. It's a return to Eden, and it continues in Christ. The New Testament calls Jesus our great high priest, who enters the true holy place not made with hands to restore what Adam lost. In his death, the temple veil is torn. Access to sacred presence is reopened. Paul calls believers the temple of the Holy Spirit. Peter calls us a royal priesthood. Revelation ends with Eden restored, trees bearing fruit in every season, rivers of life flowing, and God dwelling once more with humanity. The story comes full circle. Eden is not a fable left in the past. It is the blueprint of the future. So, when we say Eden was a temple and Adam was a priest, we are not being metaphorical. We are being biblical. The language, the symbols, the geography, and the priestly vocabulary all confirm it. Eden was the first sacred space where God dwelled with humanity. Adam's task was priestly. His failure led to exile, not just from a place, but from divine presence. And the entire story of Scripture is the story of that presence being restored, not by rebuilding a garden, but by transforming people into the new sanctuary. Eden, then, is not merely where we came from. It's where we are called to return, not just physically, but spiritually, to a life of worship, of sacred duty, of walking with God in the cool of the day. That was Adam's priesthood. And through Christ, it can be ours again, hidden within. The early chapters of Genesis is a passage so brief and so enigmatic that entire theological systems have struggled to contain it. It reads like a myth, sounds like legend, and yet it stands firm within the canon of sacred Scripture. Genesis 6:1-4 speaks of a time when the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. The result of this union? The Nephilim giants, mighty men of old, men of renown. Just 4 verses. But within them lie profound implications about the nature of creation, the boundaries between heaven and earth, and the consequences of divine rebellion. This story is strange, but it is not isolated. Its themes echo across cultures, across continents, and through time, speaking to an ancient and universal memory of spiritual breach. The identity of the sons of God has been debated for centuries. Are they fallen angels? Divine beings? Members of a godly lineage? The oldest Jewish interpretations, preserved in texts like 1 Enoch and echoed in early Christian writings, are clear. These are celestial beings, watchers, heavenly hosts who crossed a line they were never meant to cross. They abandoned their assigned realms and took human women for themselves. This act was not simply immoral, it was cosmic treason, a violation of the created order. Heaven and earth were meant to remain distinct. The divine was never meant to merge with the human in this way, but they did. And what followed was not blessing, but corruption. The offspring of this union were the Nephilim, a word that literally means fallen ones. They are described as giants, as warriors, as beings of legend, but their presence is not celebrated. It is ominous. They are the symptom of a world unraveling, of knowledge and power used in ways never intended. Genesis tells us that this was one of the final provocations that led to the flood, the cleansing of the earth. In other words, the Nephilim were not just aberrations, they were catalysts, evidence that the boundary between heaven and earth had been pierced and that the consequences could not be contained. And this is not a story unique to Genesis. Cultures around the world speak of similar events. Divine beings who came down, took human wives, and produced extraordinary offspring. In Greek mythology, the gods often descended to earth to intermix with mortals, creating demigods like Hercules and Perseus, figures of great strength and tragic fate. The Mesopotamian Apkallu, semi-divine sages from before the flood, were said to have passed down forbidden knowledge to humans. The Sumerian Anunnaki were believed to be powerful beings from the heavens who intervened in human affairs. In Hindu tradition, we find the Devas and Asuras, beings whose interactions with humanity shaped epics and cosmic cycles. These legends differ in detail but align in structure. The intermingling of divine and human realms leads to chaos, corruption, and eventually, divine judgment. What we see in these global narratives is not coincidence, it's convergence. Different tongues, different symbols, but the same underlying truth, that there was a time when spiritual boundaries were transgressed, and the result was catastrophic. The flood in Genesis is mirrored in the flood of Gilgamesh, in the inundations of Mesoamerican myth, in the deluge stories of China and Africa and the Pacific Islands. Everywhere, the theme repeats divine interference, human arrogance, and the judgment of the waters. The Book of Enoch, though not part of the biblical canon, expands on Genesis 6 in ways that mirror these ancient concerns. It names the rebellious angels, led by a figure called Semyaza, and describes how they taught humanity secrets not meant for them: sorcery, astrology, weaponry, enchantments. The knowledge was advanced, powerful, even useful, but it was forbidden. Humanity, unprepared to wield it, descended into violence, exploitation, and despair. Civilization progressed, but in the wrong direction. The Watchers descended not to bless, but to possess. The line between stewardship and domination was shattered. This story, mythic and strange though it may be, speaks to something deeply human. Our longing for transcendence, our attraction to power, and our inability to bear it rightly. We crave divine knowledge, but we do not understand its cost. In the ancient world, this took the form of spiritual interbreeding and supernatural corruption. Today, it may look different: genetic manipulation, unchecked technology, artificial intelligence that we cannot control. The patterns change, but the heart remains the same. When we reach for godlike power without godlike character, we unleash consequences we cannot predict. The Nephilim, then, are not just ancient giants. They are archetypes, symbols of a world unmoored from its divine order, and their legacy lingers. Even after the flood, they appear again in Numbers 13, where the Israelite spies report giants in the land of Canaan. The descendants of Anak, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. Whether literal or legendary, the memory persists. The fear, the awe, the recognition that there are forces in the world greater than ourselves, forces that once walked among us and may yet return. The Genesis account reminds us is that spiritual rebellion always comes at a cost. The sons of God abandoned their posts, and the world descended into chaos. Adam failed in the Temple of Eden, and death entered the world. Cain killed his brother, and civilization built its first city in exile. And in every case, the pattern is the same: humans reaching for power apart from God and finding ruin instead of glory. But Scripture also tells a deeper story. Where Adam failed, Christ prevails. Where the sons of God corrupted, the Son of God redeems. Where the Nephilim brought fear, the gospel brings peace. In Jesus, the divine and human are united again, not through transgression, but through incarnation, not through exploitation, but through humility. He is not a fallen one, but the risen one, not a hybrid of heaven and earth by rebellion, but the perfect union of both by divine design. The Nephilim remind us of what happens when we grasp at the sacred without reverence. Jesus reminds us of what happens when the sacred descends in love. In that contrast lies the heart of the gospel, and the hope that the chaos, once unleashed, will not have the final word. Because in the end, it is not the giants of old who will inherit the earth, but the meek. Not the men of renown, but the faithful. Not the hybrids of rebellion, but the sons and daughters of God by grace. And so the story of Genesis 6, strange and shadowed though it is, remains essential. It warns us, it humbles us, but it also prepares us, because it is only in knowing the darkness of what was that we can fully appreciate the light of what is to come. The Nephilim may have been mighty, but they fell. Christ was broken, but he rose. And that reversal is the story the whole Bible tells, from Genesis to Revelation, from exile to Eden regained. This isn't just about the past. It's your story too. We've traveled from ancient gardens to forgotten temples, from enigmatic giants to stone-carved sanctuaries buried beneath millennia of dust. We've explored the two creation accounts of Genesis, the priesthood of Adam, the mystery of Cain's exile, the echoes of Eden in global myth, and the monumental traces of civilizations that challenge everything we thought we knew. But beneath the mystery, beneath the layers of history and theology, one truth has remained. Humanity was created not merely to exist, but to walk with God. Eden was never just a garden. It was a communion, a sacred relationship. And when that was lost, everything fractured. Adam's fall was not just a moment of disobedience. It was the breaking of a covenant, the desecration of a sacred space, and the beginning of exile, not just from a place, but from presence. Ever since, we've wandered. We've built altars, temples, cities, and empires. We've searched the stars and studied the stones, longing for what was lost, sensing deep within that there was once something more. Eden is more than a story, a memory embedded in the soul of humanity, a longing that science can't explain and technology can't satisfy. And yet, the story doesn't end in exile. Because where the first Adam failed, the last Adam came to restore. Jesus doesn't just come to forgive sin. He comes to reverse the curse. He enters the story not as a mere teacher or prophet, but as the embodiment of Eden's original design, the true priest, the living temple, the image of the invisible God. He faces the tempter and does not fall. He hangs on a tree so that the gate to the garden might open once again. His resurrection isn't just victory over death, it's the beginning of new creation. The promise that Eden will return God in him, the sacred presence of God, is no longer confined to one garden or temple or altar. It walks again among us, not behind flaming swords or veils, but in the hearts of those who receive him. Through Christ, you are invited back. Not back in time, but back into purpose, back into communion. You were made for sacred space. You were made to walk with God. This story is not myth. It's not metaphor. It's a map, and it's pointing forward. Revelation doesn't end with escape from the world. It ends with a garden city, with rivers and trees, with healing and light. It ends with Eden restored, not in isolation, but in fullness. And the gate that was once shut is now open not by your striving, but by his sacrifice. So the question is no longer, what happened back then? The question is, what will you do now? Will you remain in exile, building towers of self and chasing shadows of Eden? Or will you return to the one who made you, the one who walked in the cool of the day and now stands at the door of your heart, waiting to walk with you again? The invitation is open. The way is made. The temple has been rebuilt not in stone, but in spirit. Eden is no longer lost. Through Christ, it's coming back. And you are always meant to be part of it. If this journey stirred something in you, if it made you question, wonder, or see the ancient story with new eyes, then don't let it stop here. There's more to uncover, more to restore, and more. Truth waiting in the pages of Scripture and the stones of our past dot. So if you're drawn to the deeper layers of the biblical story, the mysteries hidden in plain sight, and the echoes of Eden still ringing through history, make sure to subscribe. This is just the beginning. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and hit the bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Because the journey back to Eden isn't just about looking behind, it's about moving forward. Together. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep digging, keep wondering, and keep walking toward the sacred. The sacred.